And Orice Tanner and I met, let's see, 30-something years ago. Say 32 years ago. And I was hanging out with Orice and talking, and one of the realizations, I had lent him Blood Meridian, which I keep recommending to everyone. You must read it. Cormac McCarthy. Cormac McCarthy, the author, the book he'll probably be remembered for most, Blood Meridian, which is, for people here in this area, should be required reading, quite frankly, because it is based and set here about 160 years ago. And it is something else. And Orice had read it in the meantime. And so when I went to talk to him, he was eager, and I was pretty eager to discuss the book. And I'm not going to give spoilers away, but it's pretty obvious that this is a book about brutal, violent, frontier behavior. The pioneers of this area, but told in a very honest way. More honest than anything I'd ever read. And when Orice and I were talking, we were talking as two people of color growing up in this area of San Antonio, Texas, where they sent us to public schools, and they had a class called Texas History. And the Texas history would go on. You would be taking it for several years even. And the things that they taught us in the era of the 80s, when there was just 4 television channels, no internet, no way to get information really other than the newspaper, maybe stray magazines, and one of these 3 or 4 channels, the information that they told us that just in the time period since we were, say, 13 years old to the time that we're 50, that 37 years is night and day. They told us Columbus sailed the ocean blue in 1492 and discovered America, and I know now that Eratosthenes had measured that the world was round in 300 years before Christ. They told us insane things about how Texas was settled. And everyone here, even to this day, this is the 300th anniversary of San Antonio de Bejar. And the celebration is predominantly about inculcating pioneers and settlers, far more than it is about sharing the historical facts of the genocide and the brutal extirpation of others living here and elsewhere by predominantly white European people. And the conclusion we came to, which was, I'd never said it aloud, it just was in the discussion that was bouncing around, and to me it only kind of happened because I was with him. And maybe I've thought it before, or others have said it before, or written it before, that's not the point. But I was never able to even say this aloud. And we came to a conclusion that the Europeans who had left Europe to come to the colonies, they were not the enlightened beings. They were not the spiritually higher people. They were not the more civilized. They were barbarians by comparison to the ancient world. They were the cast-outs and the people who rejected king and god, forces of authority, came to a new place where there was no king or god, and did whatever they want. And they went, Lord of the Flies, all over this place. And they labeled the people living here as the barbarian, heathen, heretic, filthy animals, subhuman creatures. And they grabbed subhuman creatures, the way they preceded them from Africa, and dragged them here to be their slaves. And they built the entire society within which the history of the winners, of the victors, creates this insanely wide, but pretty shallow mythology that goes from California to New York, from Maine to San Diego, that taught us kids in the 80s utter nonsense, which has culminated in a society that is uttering jingoistic phraseology about nonsensical history. And instead of allowing its people to study its own culture and develop it, stamping out science, stamping out reason, stamping out truths for the sake of a social truth that's being held up by predominantly white men from Europe, reaching back. And now the reach to Russia by those white men who have played their last trump card for power in an increasingly diverse society seems obvious. But that feeling that they were the barbarians, and we're living here in a society built by crude, boorish idiots, feels factual. My ancient mind, from the teachings of my parents in India down to me today, has suffered these 30 years listening to the nonsense I hear people saying all around me for decades. And then the last 15 years of incredible decline of intellectual culture, of philology, of learning, of love of learning in the United States has made it sickening and depressing, and not the best place in the world to be. So these are some thoughts I had. One with Brent, my visitor, the musician, a white American for whom the system works perfectly, but I don't think he believes he's privileged. I don't think he senses or knows his own privilege. And a black friend of mine from a decade before who had just recently finished reading Blood Meridian. I don't think I could get Brent to read Blood Meridian. That's what's the sad truth.